Climate change is defined as the persistent change in climate that sticks around for a long period of time. And this change is widely accepted as being caused by human activities. Global climate averages are 1 degree Celsius hotter than pre-industrial era averages and are predicted to reach between 2.1 and 3.4 degrees Celsius hotter by 2100 if we do not act. It is known that the increase in manufacturing, mining, logging, and agriculture that has coincided with the rise of globalization has contributed to the high levels of GHG emissions in the Earth's atmosphere. Higher income countries have disproportionately profited from these activities. New Zealand is a part of the 37 industrialized nations in the Kyoto Protocol, classified as being most responsible for the current high levels of GHG emissions in the atmosphere, and has ratified its 3 market-based mechanisms: the International Emissions Trading, Clean Development Mechanism, and Joint Implementation. According to the IPCC, the impacts of climate change in Pacific nations has moved faster than in other parts of the world, with sea levels rises combined with storms and king tides causing saltwater intrusion on lands in the Pacific, disrupting the economy and agriculture as well as displacing people. These changes have especially threatened Kiribati, whose land surface is lower than the 2.3 meters above sea level, and there are ocean waves 3.5 meters high. It is predicted that Pacific Island nations will face further land loss as well as loss of arable land from saltwater incursion, leading to future disputes and conflicts over resources and threats to regional stability. The Paris Agreement is a legally binding international treaty with the goal of holding the average increase in temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius and limited it to 1.5 above pre-industrial averages. New Zealand has ratified the Paris Agreement, and to meet its targets, it must reduce emissions by investing in resilience initiatives and green infrastructure, more renewables, nature-based solutions, and restore biodiversity. These steps are important as the rights of Pacific people are under threat due to climate change, and these rights include the right to life, property, and livelihood. Limited natural resources, geographical distance from major world centers, and vulnerability to climate change make Pacific Island nations likely to require refugee status in the future. According to the United Nations Declaration Convention related to the status of refugees, climate refugees are not recognized. Currently, New Zealand does not accept climate change as a grounds for refugee status. However, on 2 occasions, courts have allowed Pacific nationals to stay on humanitarian grounds based on the effects of climate change on their homelands. By contrast, in 2020, a farmer from a Pacific atoll was denied as a climate refugee in New Zealand. This mixed response highlights the need for a consistent framework for recognizing climate refugees from Pacific nations. New Zealand regularly deports Pacific Island nationals who try to claim refugee status. Though the argument that New Zealand has violated Articles 6 and 7 of the ICCPR by deporting climate refugees to places where their lives are at risk due to climate change has been asserted by several legal scholars. These scholars have described parallels between the hardships arising from climate change and human rights violations. During the 2016 Conference of Parties in Cancun, Mexico, one mitigation strategy discussed was future planned migration and a climate refugee framework that could be a part of this strategy. New Zealand can better respond to the threats of climate change to the Pacific, not only by reducing its emissions, but also by allowing climate refugees to claim asylum while protecting their rights as enshrined under UNHCR and UNDRIP. When accepting climate refugees from the Pacific, because of the neoliberal economy in New Zealand, there's a risk that these refugees will be reduced to surplus populations or be valued solely based on their economic production. As a Pacific Island nation itself, New Zealand has a special responsibility to other Pacific Island nations, While all wealthy nations who have disproportionately contributed to greenhouse gas emissions have responsibility to those who have contributed very little, it is more pragmatic for New Zealand as a neighbor with close ties to the Pacific to take on more of this responsibility. Some of the rights enshrined in the UNDRIP include right to nationality, right to health, right to security, land, and self-governance. Under the United Nations Human Rights Declaration, New Zealand will have several responsibilities to potential future climate refugees, including ensuring adequate housing, equal economic opportunities, education, freedom from discrimination, equality in the justice system, and cultural participation. Additionally, under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, New Zealand will have responsibilities to protect mental and physical health, cultural and spiritual practices, cross-border connections, practice of customs without forced enculturation and assimilation, and maintenance of institutional structures. Because there is no current specific framework in New Zealand for accepting refugees on the basis of climate, and the contradiction in court rulings regarding refugee status for the basis of climate, it is important for New Zealand to consider creating a refugee framework for climate refugees from Pacific nations. Offering a human rights-based approach to climate-induced refugees would be a promising step forward that New Zealand could take to address their responsibilities to their Pacific neighbors. The high levels of emissions that New Zealand has contributed to the climate crisis and the relationship as neighbors to other Pacific countries increases the level of responsibility New Zealand has. The psychological impacts of resettlement could not be understated when it comes to the climate refugees crisis from the Pacific Island nations. Many of these refugees will identify as indigenous, and there are psychological impacts of displacement from their ancestral lands, as well as lost connections to their culture if they are forced to assimilate into the dominant culture of their host country. And this would be traumatic. These psychological impacts can include distress, worse mental health outcomes, and risk of suicide. Despite these risks, New Zealand is often the preferred place for climate refugees from Pacific Island nations. Therefore, it is imperative that as the potential host country for these refugees, New Zealand consider creating a framework based on humanitarian principles while also respecting the rights of Pacific Islanders as defined in the UNDRIP to facilitate the preservation of the Pacific cultures.